closely. James chapter 5, look at verse 1. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you have kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you. Therefore, be patient, brethren, till the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until he receives the earth early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You've heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. May God bless me to his word. May it be sanctified in our hearts. Father, we pray that you bless your word today. Anoint this your servant to speak clearly and accurately the unsearchable riches of Christ. Anoint and prepare the hearts of your people to hear the unsearchable riches of Christ. Open that heart, that man, that woman, that boy or girl have never come to faith in Christ. Maybe that they might believe today. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated in the presence of the Lord. I want to speak to you this morning for the next 33 minutes from the subject of the God of justice. The God of justice, warnings to the rich, encouragement to the oppressed. The God of justice, warnings to the rich, encouragement to the oppressed. Much of the tension that exists in our country today, exists around this theme of income inequality. You hear politicians talking about it. I'm certainly sure it's going to be a major point of discussion that we hotly debated in the upcoming presidential and congressional and gubernatorial races around the country. There was a Wall Street movement last year to disrupt the activity on Wall Street by those groups that feel like income inequality is an unjust and unfair economic inequity of our time. There are some that argue that the only way to address income inequality is through taxation. It's that the government tax the upper income brackets at very high rates. The government then takes that money and the government redistributes it the way the government thinks it should be redistributed. There are others that argue the position that we need a small federal government, and their proposition is that the framers of the Constitution and the founders of the United States of America believed in limited federal government, and that the states is where the power should rest and reside, and that the federal government should keep their cotton-picking hands out of people's money. And so they argued, let the capitalistic free enterprise system work, and whoever can amaze most of the capital is theirs to keep. And they believe in the principle of the golden rule. Whoever has the most gold, they make and they set and they establish all the rules for the rest of us to live by. So there's certainly polarized positions as to where we are as a country. But there's one thing that is irrefutable, is that the wealth of this country is concentrated today in a way that maybe has not been since the very founding of the country, when the wealth was concentrated in the hands of the landowners, because our nation basically was designed by the landowners and intended to be a nation that would basically be ruled by the land and the property owners. We'll speak to that a little more in just a moment. So the question that is begging for a response is, what does the church do? And what is the church's position? Does the church advocate and advance the Robin Hood theory of economics? We take all the money from the rich and we give it to the poor. I don't think that would work, because the rich would have it back the next day, because we'd go out and buy CDs and we would go out and buy used cars and all those type of things. We wouldn't build factories and plants and means of production, so that certainly is not going to work. But we do, as the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ, have to understand, what does the Bible teach about economics and what does it teach about justice? Because much of the social upheaval that's happened in our country, in the existence of this nation, has been around economics. Who would control it? Who would have it? And how would it be disseminated? So I'm going to try to lay out this morning just for your thinking and to try to provoke you to start thinking this matter through, because it's not going to go away. And we're going to see more protests and more demonstration, and I predict that we will see more disruption during the presidential election than any time in history. And you're going to see it start to emerge even in the primaries, as different groups will be protesting. They will show up at presidential candidates' speeches and at events to basically challenge them, to confront them, and to make them respond to their issue. This is just where we are. And there are some who have decided the only way to get the powerful broker's attention is through direct confrontation. And whether we agree with that or not, that's what many believe, because it appears that otherwise the masses are often ignored. But let's see what the Bible has to say. And anytime you're going to try to establish a biblical principle, you have to go back to the book of Genesis, because Genesis is the seed plot for the Bible. So if God introduces something in the book of Genesis, that means you have to follow that narrative all the way through the Bible to get a clear understanding of what is the principle that God teaches on that particular issue. And so as we talk about economics and work and economic justice and equity and fairness, we have to go back to the book of Genesis. So in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, we find the first principle that God lays down about work and about economics. It's after God has created Eden, and in Genesis 2:15 it says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to tend and keep it. Now I don't have time to go into the details of that, but man at creation was given a job, and his job was to tend the Garden of Eden. So it's always been God's principle that men and women are to earn their keep by the sweat of their brow. Now Genesis 2:15 is before sin is entered. It's before the fall. Now I don't know exactly what Adam's job was going to be, because there was no thorns, there was no thistles, there was no weeds that was growing up. It had never rained before. The atmosphere has not become polluted. God caused the mist to come up from the ground, basically to hydrate all the plants. I don't know what his job was, maybe just to watch stuff grow and just to marvel about it and praise God about how beautiful it was, and then go out and pick whatever he wanted to eat from it. But he had a job of tending something, of taking care of something. Man is at his noblest, he's at his best when he has something to do, something to be responsible for. So the worst society you can have is a society where a group of men, particularly young men, don't have anything to do. They have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to be. They have no one depending on them or waiting on them to do anything. Martin Luther King predicted almost 40 years ago that the unraveling of the American economy would be if she continued to ignore the plight of the poor. And if you had a whole generation who felt like they had no economic interest in maintaining the system. And unfortunately, we're moving farther and farther in that direction. In the state of West Virginia, there are 56,000 young people between the ages of 16 to 24, 56,000 who are not in school and who are not working. And over 23% of them already have children. They're not in school and they're not working. And that number is moving closer to 60,000. Yet no one really is talking about what are we going to do to place this 60,000 into something that's going to lead to a skill that this economy needs. And so many of them are headed toward the adult prison system. Others are headed toward a lifetime of welfare and social policy dependency. And many of them were disengaged from civic engagement. So the worst society you can produce is a society where young people are disengaging from civic engagement, not paying attention to the political process, not trying to become an educated, informed voter. No sense of volunteerism, no sense of social service, no sense of trying to rebuild the place where I live. Oh, we need to bring Martin Luther King back, and we'll listen to him this time. Martin Luther King said almost 40 years ago, he says the community service is the price that we pay for the space that we occupy, and that everyone has some responsibility to try to improve the space where they live, the air, the oxygen, the environment where they live. And we all have a responsibility to try to be rebuilding and reinventing the space that we occupy. It's a debt that we all have. It's not just for the privileged few. And so God establishes that work is dignified, all work is dignified, and all work should be fairly compensated in the economic system, and labor cannot be demeaned. Because when you demean manual labor, you create an unhealthy tension between those with the labor and those with the land and with the capital. Are y'all listening to me? Now, the second point we see in the book of Genesis about God's perspective on work, on labor, and on economics, we find in verse 17. This is after Adam has taken from the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he has eaten. This is after the fall. God is now pronouncing a curse on the serpent, the devil, a curse upon the man and the woman for their cosmic treason, for their violation of God's commandment. And so in speaking to Adam, here's what God said in verse 17 of Genesis 3. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying, you should not eat, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Adam messed it up. He had a good thing going. He had a perfect garden, in a perfect Eden, a plush job, and now everything turns. Now the Garden of Eden turns into a jungle. And now thorns and thistles and weeds and briars and thickets and poison ivy and poison oak, all this stuff is now growing up and overtaking the garden. And so just going out every day and marveling at God's creation and worshiping God, now he got to work. He got to fight the elements just to get something to eat. And so when men and women go out to work and they say it's a jungle out there, that's the truth. It's a jungle out there. It's work, it's hard, it is difficult, it is hard because of the curse of sin that's upon the earth. And so labor is hard, labor is difficult, and it requires us to engage and to concentrate and to focus and to stay after it. And just when we think we got it mastered, something else pops up. And that's the legacy of sin. That's the legacy of the curse. What God has promised, however, is that God has placed everything that mankind needs for sustenance in the earth. It's in the ground. Everything that we need is in the earth or in the ground or is connected to the hydraulical cycle whereby there is condensation, evaporation, precipitation. But in the end, it's all on the earth. So the earth belongs to God, and everything in the earth belongs to God, and God has placed everything in the earth necessary to sustain human life on the earth. And every man and every woman, every boy and every girl are supposed to be looking at how they can carve out and scratch out a living from the earth. Are you following me? Now, in an agrarian society, in a farming economy, this is more obvious. It's more obvious in a farming economy when everybody is dependent upon the ground. Everyone is planting seed, and everyone is cultivating seed and praying for the rain to come, but not too much rain, and trying to fight off the boll weevils and trying to keep the deer out the garden and keep the rabbits out the garden. When everybody's going in an agriculture, they understand their dependency upon the earth. So this generation, they don't understand dependency on the earth. You ask somebody today, 20, 30-year-olds, first and where does cabbage come from, and they'll tell you Kroger's or Walmart. No, nobody no farming, none about cultivating the earth, but all of our produce comes from the earth. It comes from the ground, and we're still dependent upon the earth. And those folk down in Alabama, they found that out the last harvest season. Oh, they got so self-righteous and so indignant, we're going to pass these immigration reform laws, and we're going to drive all these illegal aliens, all these undocumented workers, we're going to drive them out of Alabama. So they passed the law, and people, the undocumented workers, they started to flee and surround the state. Then the harvest season came. The watermelons rotting on the ground. The cabbage, everything rotting on the ground, because the poor black folk and the poor white folk, they wasn't going out there working in the hot sun all day for $12 an hour. They felt they had graduated above that. I'm not making this up. They thought they had graduated above that, because for years this country has been fed, by and large, by the illegal, what you want to call them, undocumented workers, I prefer to call them, who come in here and would do this hard work and this hard labor, are working on this hot sun, wouldn't have no oranges, wouldn't have no grapefruit. It wasn't for the Hispanics coming in here and picking all that stuff off the ground and out of trees. Now we begin to figure that out. And this immigration reform religion the politicians have gotten, this is a bunch of nonsense. It's a bunch of hypocrites. These people have got immigration reform because now it's caught up to them. They understand that more people understand what is going on and how the Hispanics in particular have been exploited. The labor has been exploited, and now 50,000 Hispanic Latino people turn 18 every month. 50,000. So heretofore, moving forward, every election in the United States of America at the national level, every presidential election is going to depend on which party can get the largest portion of the Hispanic Latino vote. That's why they get immigration reform religion in Washington. Now they become a major, major political bloc, and they are a major economic bloc in this country. And so that's how things change ever so quickly. And you start looking at where problems are, you'll often find it's because there's economic exploitation that is taking place. And when people figure it out, they rebel against it. They rebel against it. Every people group rebels against economic exploitation once they figure out that's what's happening to them. So God established a system of economic justice. Everybody should be working. Everybody should be carving their livelihood out of the earth. If you look at the nation of Israel, God even made it more prescriptive. That all of the 12 tribes got a piece of land, a piece of real estate, because in an agrarian, farming, livestock economy, you need land for your cattle and your sheep and your oxen to graze. You need land to plow and to plant seed and to harvest crop. So everybody got a piece of land. And that's why in the Jewish economy, there was economic justice, because every 50 years, the land went back to the original family, the original landowners, because God didn't want anybody in the Jewish nation to ever be in a system where they were permanently and perpetually economically exploited. Now, that won't work here. But what that teaches us as an object lesson of God's commitment to economic justice. The whole liberation of the nation of Israel out of Egyptian bondage was all about economic justice, because God said through Moses, my people cannot serve me the way I want them to serve me in slavery, because they cannot praise me and worship me the way I want to be praised and worshiped, because they're not benefiting from their own labor. And so the Exodus was necessary, because God wanted his people to worship him fully and truly, an expression of worship. And that's what church ought to be about. We just kind of forget that now. What church ought to be about is we come together. God moved it from Saturday to Sunday. We come together and celebrate on the first day of the week everything that God has done for us the previous 7 days and what he's going to do for us the next week. And we celebrate the fact that we've been able to go out and we've been able to labor and we've been able to earn wages and buy food and provide housing and clothing and shelter and health care. And we can't wait to get together, lift our hands and praise and bless God to tell somebody how good God has been to us. And that's what church ought to be. It ought to be a perpetual cycle of blessing and celebration. And so when we come to church and don't praise and worship God like we ought to, it's the ultimate act of ingratitude and unthankfulness and of spiritual arrogance to assume we did it our way. We did it all ourselves with our intellectual acumen, with our physical ability. We were able to do all this stuff ourselves. Are y'all going to help me? We can't even wake ourselves up in the morning. I was watching something the other night on the History Channel. They were talking about the chemicals that got to go off in your brain for you to wake up in the morning. And that's what happens. You get these chemical imbalances when you're suffering from insomnia because the chemicals are all out of whack, so they're not working when they're supposed to work. That's all a part of God's design and God's plan. So God establishes in Genesis. It's about work. It's about everybody working. About everybody doing what they can do. Everybody making some contribution. And that's the way their dignity is affirmed. Let me move quickly. This is going to become a two-part message. I can see this already because I chased that rabbit all the way down to Alabama early. I didn't mean to chase that rabbit through Alabama. I wasn't going to Alabama this morning, but I've been to Alabama already. But I'm going to lay the foundation so you can see where we're going to go on next week. Paul reaffirms that we don't have time to turn, though, but Paul reaffirms this in 1 Timothy 5:17 through 19. In 1 Timothy 5:17 through 19, in that context, he starts off talking about the fact that the elder that rules well, the one who labors in word and doctrine, should be taken care of. He quotes from Deuteronomy 5:24, which says you shouldn't muzzle the mouth of the oxen while he's treading out corn. Now, Paul goes to Deuteronomy, the law, and he says, you farmers, you agrarian folk, when you're out there in the field and you're treading out the corn and you're harvesting the crop, you can't put a muzzle on the oxen's mouth. You got to let the oxen consume some of the corn while he's treading the corn out. Otherwise, he's going to die from famish. He's going to pass out, and you're not going to harvest anything. So you can't work the oxen to exhaustion. Paul takes that principle from Deuteronomy, applies it in the human realm. He says, the laborer is worthy of its hire. Now I want y'all to start practicing something that I practice. Every time I go to the store and pull out my few shekels in my pocket and pay for a good or service, I ask one simple question: where is that money going? Where is that money going? If you think the process through, you'll be amazed that as soon as you put that money on that counter. Now, if you use a card, it is fast in the twinkling of an eye. Because if you use one of them debit cards, one of them credit cards, as soon as you swipe that, brother, that money is transferred out of here. Transferred out of the state of West Virginia. And very often transferred some other state. That quick, that fast. When I walk into the grocery store occasionally, not often, when I go occasionally, I see them little mamas in with them little kids. And they take out their card, used to call the food stamps, now it's called the TANF card. And now they put their stuff on the card. As soon as they swipe that card, that money is going out this neighborhood. Only a few dollars stay in the neighborhood to pay the people that are working in the store and pay them, but most of it is transferred out of the neighborhood. Every single day on the west side of Charleston, $1 million is transferred out of this community. 1 million. And very little of it comes back into the neighborhood because there's not a commitment to economic reciprocity. How many of y'all got Mountaineer gas? How many got Appalachian Power? How many got American Water? How many of y'all living in the dark? You got a well. My point is that Mountaineer Gas, Appalachian Power, Western Water, Sudden Leak, Sprint, Intellos, all these people are transferring money out of your neighborhood every single day. And in case of a poor neighborhood like the West Side, it almost never comes back. Only crumbs come back in the form of wages paid to those day laborers. Is that just? A lot of these big companies give their money downtown to the Clay Center. How many of y'all go? A few of y'all go to Clay Center. But how many people on the West Side go to the Clay Center? How does it benefit them? How does it benefit them to give the money to downtown when the money is coming out of the West Side? That's not fair and that's not just. We're not a poor community. We got $300 million in income. It's just transferred out of here every single day at the rate of about $1 million a day. And there's not a commitment to reinvesting much of it back in the neighborhood. That's not fair. That's not just. And we create these grand illusions as if there's something wrong with the people. Nothing wrong with the people. The system is what's not fair. The system is what is not just. Well, I'm going to tie this all together next week. But I want to lay out another piece of foundational information. This will be helpful to you, just in case you're not here next week. Because you can read the Bible for yourself. What I'm going to say, you got to come here to get it. That's what I'm glad I'm off the radio. And any more people still telling me they hear me on the radio. I ain't been on the radio in 6 months. Oh, we heard Reverend Watts on the radio, right? Now you got to come here to get it. I believe the United States of America was established by Christian people, for the most part. And I believe they established this country on the Judeo-Christian ethic. They believed in hard work. They believed in labor. But the fundamental mistake they made, is they established the country on a flawed economic foundation. A flawed economic foundation. It was established on a flawed economic foundation that allowed for the exploitation of labor. And it has been perpetuated for the 240, 50 years that we have been here. And that's why we are where we are now. And let me explain it to you in brief overview. The first labor exploitation was tried to be imposed upon the Native Americans. There was an attempt to put the Native Americans in slavery. They just wouldn't go for it. They just wouldn't accept it. They were free people. They could survive in this land all by themselves. And so they fought against that. So that particular plan was eventually aborted. And then the decision was made that the Native Americans had to be driven out of certain parts of the land because the land was needed to build the economy. That's a whole other sermon. The second labor exploitation scheme was that of the indentured servants. Most people go to college and study history, and they never teach you in history that the original founders of this nation intended for this to primarily be a European nation. It wasn't being built to be a nation where there was going to be a diversity. It was primarily a European nation, primarily with Caucasian people. That was the original intent and the original design. They had no intention of bringing race-based slavery to the New World. None at all. That experiment was already proven to be problematic in Europe. They had no intention of bringing it here. The plan was, and read your history closely, the plan was that this nation would be built on indentured servants. The poor, white, indentured servants in Europe that was trapped in the caste system of Europe. And what they would do, they would pay their way to the New World. In return, they would sign an indentured form on an indentured contract. The indentured contract normally lasts 4 to 7 years. So you were selling yourself into servitude for 4 to 7 years, and they planned to build this country on the back of the indentured servants. After 4 to 7 years, the indentured servant received freedom dues. Freedom dues was 100 acres of land, a change of clothing, and a gun. That was the plan. And each of the original people who came here, they were given so much additional land for every indentured servant they brought in because you had to populate the land. The land needed to be populated if you were going to grow the amount of crop that was necessary to be grown. Tobacco was the first cash crop. It was the staple of the colonies because it was so popular in Europe. And then it gradually moved to expand to cotton becoming king and rice. But cotton, tobacco, and rice were the two major products grown in the New World that was exported to the rest of the world. But here's the problem. The problem was that many of the indentured servants wouldn't go along with the program. And they would escape, they would run off, they'd break their contracts, and then it got worse than that. Word got back to Europe how hard it was being an indentured servant. And once the word got back, fewer poor Europeans were willing to sell 4 to 7 years of their life to come to this waste-howling wilderness called the New World. Many of them died before they were able to pay the 4 to 7 years. So they had difficulty getting people to get on the boat, if you know what I mean. They couldn't get these people to get on this boat, so now they got a major problem. But the big problem happened in 1661. Go back and check your history. The first Civil War was not in 1861. The first Civil War was in 1661, over 100 years before the United States became a nation. The ex-indentures and some of the current indentures are white folk. They created a rebellion. They tried to overthrow Jamestown. The whole Jamestown government had to go into hiding because these people were armed with guns and weapons. They were not satisfied with the exploitation of the system. That was the first Civil War fought on the soil. That is when the planters, the landowners, realized this is not going to work. It's not going to work, us trying to force these people into indentured contracts, and that's when the idea was we've got to go to race-based slavery. Race-based slavery is nothing like people thought it was. It wasn't some monolith. It happened over a period of time. It happened between 1607 and 1661 before Massachusetts, the first state to become a slaveholding state. Then the other states in the colony followed. Slavery was not a problem with the South. It was a pandemic. It was in all the colonies. So then the move was from the indentured system to race-based slavery. So the race-based slavery system took hold for real in about 1661, started about 1640, and the race-based slavery system extended all the way to 1865, right? Not with the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863, but with the signing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865. That's what ended race-based slavery. But just a little bit of history that's important for you to see. Click up the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, in my opinion, is probably the most uniquely crafted phrase in the history of the New World, and every time I read it, I see another nuance, something I never saw before, of how brilliant those people were, and they knew exactly what they were doing. This is what the 13th Amendment actually says, and this is the document that supposedly ended slavery in the United States of America. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punished for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States of America in any place subject to the jurisdiction. Now what's amazing here, in a marvelous economy of words, in 32 words, slavery was abolished and reinstituted in the same clause. In the same clause, look at it. It ends slavery with the first part of the clause. Then the exception said, except for the punishment of a crime. So the 13th Amendment gives the United States government the right to reimpose slavery upon anyone that commits a felony crime. That's important. And I never heard anybody talk about this. Never heard the legal scholars talk about this. Slavery is still technically legal in the United States of America and can be practiced by the federal and state government as the punishment for a crime. Now what's even more powerful is the second phrase, section 2. With 11 words, and a marvelous economy of 11 words, the 13th Amendment gives Congress the power to regulate slavery upon people that have been convicted for crimes. And the Congress have interpreted that to mean capital punishment, which can be death, which is still legal in many states, or incarceration for life. But Congress has also interpreted that to mean that we can pass laws that will result in a punishment that will be inflicted upon a person for the rest of their natural life, right? For the rest of their natural life. So anytime someone is convicted of a felony crime, without actually saying it in the text, what Congress has the authority to do, and what the states have the authority to do, is to limit and restrict and revoke citizenship rights of a person that's been convicted. And it never says it anywhere, but that's what those minimum 11 words allow them to do. And y'all are looking at me strange because no one ever talked to you about this in civics class. The truth of the matter is, once a person is convicted of a felony crime, while they're in prison, their First Amendment right to freedom of speech is infringed upon. Because they don't exactly have total free speech while they're in prison. They have very other limited rights. But secondly, their Second Amendment right to bear arms is permanently revoked for the rest of their life. Now, how much sense does this make? I write bad checks. I ain't never been in a fight. I ain't never hurt nobody. I ain't never done it to anybody. I always write bad checks. So I go to prison for a felony. When I get out, I can't own a firearm. What sense does that make? But that's what that does. Second Amendment right is taken away. Not only is the right to bear arms taken away, but the right of equal protection under the law, which the 14th Amendment is supposed to have granted, is also infringed upon. Because once I'm a felon, I can be legally discriminated against at that point for employment and for housing. Now, I'm not going to get into all of this. The point I'm trying to make here is this right here allows for the government to control who is a full and complete citizen. That's what it does. And this has always been about citizenship in this country. Who has complete citizenship? I was watching someone on the television this morning about the Navajos in Arizona. Those people don't even have water on the reservation. They don't even have water. They got people trucking water in, provide them with a water supply on the Navajo plantations because all the water has been polluted where coal mines has arsenic and zinc and other harmful chemicals. So they got to go way down deep below what you normally do to dig a well. Not even water. Well, they didn't have the right to vote in 1948. Most people don't realize that. What is the ultimate expression of citizenship? The ultimate expression of citizenship is the right to vote. That is the ultimate symbolic expression of citizenship. And so that is why this country has always had certain plans in place to restrict who was a citizen, restrict who had full citizenship rights, therefore restricting who could participate as a full citizen. Are you following me? Slaves had no citizenship rights. Slaves couldn't vote. Slaves basically were not even viewed as being human. And what people fail to realize, this is 2015. This is 2015. The Voting Rights Act wasn't passed in 1965, only 50 years ago. So up until 50 years ago, the majority of people living in southern states did not have the right to vote. Most Americans don't realize that. They were still having to poll taxes, have to go in and cite the Constitution, have to go in and cite the Bill of Rights before they'd be allowed to vote. Restricting citizenship. So the indentured servant citizen, restricted citizenship, race-based slavery, and then convict leasing. I got 2 more minutes and I'll wrap it up right here. Convict leasing. Now, this is something that many of us have never even heard of. Never heard of it. Convict leasing. Most people do not realize that in the South, after Reconstruction, that slavery was reinstituted. It was reinstituted under convict leasing. Convict leasing. If you don't want to take my word for it, Douglas Blackman used to work for one of the New York newspapers, wrote an incredible book called Slavery by Another Name. If you Google it on the internet, you can go on and actually view the PBS documentary, Slavery by Another Name. And what Blackman documents to show how slavery, for real slavery, was reinstituted in the South after 1872, when the North pulled out. It was reinstituted with the black codes that were passed, and for the most part was used against blacks. So a black person could be arrested for vagrancy, put into a labor camp operated by the state, but worse, his sentence could be sold to a private business. And that private business basically could work them like a slave. This existed. Birmingham, Alabama was built on convict leasing. This was pervasive in the South. West Virginia actually practiced convict leasing, not to the extent of Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas, no, but it practiced it here. As convicts were put in coal mines to work for private coal companies because their sentences had been sold. Are you following me? I'm not making this up. You know how long this lasted? Until 1941. To 1941, America was getting ready to go into World War II. Roosevelt meets with his trusted advisors and says, we're going in on the moral high ground, that we are the city on the hill, we're the light, we're committed to truth and justice and righteousness, we're going to fight against Hitler and his fascist regime and against the empire of Japan. And he asked his trusted advisors, what could be something that could marginalize us? And his advisors said, Mr. President, we're still practicing slavery in the South under the forms of convict leasing, and Roosevelt wasn't even aware of it. So Roosevelt ends it by executive order in 1941 that convict leasing was no longer legal anywhere in the United States of America, that you could not sell a convict's sentence to a private concern, and they be worked outside of the prison as a part of a private concern. So as we wrap this up, and we'll pick it up here next week, and I'm going to tie it to James chapter 5, so you got to come next week. I'm really going to tie us all together. It's really going to tie all together, and you're going to see what James writes in James chapter 5 is applicable to us today. And you're going to see why it's so important for the church to understand this so that we can be a voice of reason, helping the broader society to think through how we can move things forward in a way that does not result in a major all-out class war, and trying to move and trying to promote fairness and justice and equity. And I want you to start by every day you spend $1, ask the simple question, where did this money go? Where is this money going? So what's happened, I'm going to close right here, and some of you sports people, y'all will appreciate this. Probably the fairest, the most equitable, and the most economically just industry in the United States of America is professional sports. In my opinion, probably the most unfair, most unjust economic system is college sports. But professional sports, for this reason, is because once they broke the hold that the owners had over professional athletes, and used to be a time the owners almost had total control over the athlete, wasn't no such thing as free agency. But once that was broken, now there is a revenue sharing. So we shouldn't be mad these athletes for making all this money, because most of this money is coming from the TV contracts and coming from the endorsements, and it's boatloads. I mean, they got to back up ships to load all this money. So the players' unions have to negotiate these deals that now we look at the revenue to come into the team, and so the pot of money for salaries is based on how large the pot of money is coming in for the teams. And they just want an equal share of that money. And that's why their salaries keep going up and keep going up, because the TV state's going to pay $1 billion plus for the rights to promote these games, and we're going to pay to go buy chicken dinners and Captain D's and all these products that advertise. There's always all this money coming in, and the players just want their fair share of the money. And they're getting it. They're getting it. So we shouldn't be angry with them. They're working this capitalistic free enterprise system to the max. And they're making sure that their labor is fairly and adequately compensated. So you can look at other industries, and you ask yourself the question. We go downtown to these hotels. How much do the people make is making of the beds? How much money do the people make that wash the dirty laundry that got to be washed to go in the new beds? And all I'm trying to say is it fair? Is it fair? How big is the profit? And so the business owners are entitled to make a profit. They should make a profit. They're taking the risk. They're the investors. But the question is, how much of the money is transferred into the hands of a few, and how much of the money is shared with the masses? And so you start asking the question, where does the money go? Where does the money go? And that is the question that more and more people are starting to answer. And we can't fix this. But what we can be is a voice of reasoning. A voice of reasoning. And the way to be a voice of reason is not to avoid the truth. You can't be a voice of reason and not talk about the truth. So if you don't want to talk about slavery, if you don't want to talk about convict leasing, if you don't want to talk about the exploitation of the migrant workers, if those things then you can't be a voice of reason. Because the voice of reason says, well, these are the facts, this is the truth, and we understand that. But despite that, can't we find some common ground as to how we can move forward toward a more fair, a more just, and a more equitable position? That's what it means to be a voice of reason. Not a militant, radical voice calling for a total dismantling of the system, but a voice that's calling for a total interrogation of the system. A total interrogation of the system. And if the system is not fair, if it's not just, then how do we make it more fair? How do we make it more just? Because if we don't, we're headed in this country for the type of social upheaval that we've only looked at from a distance in watching some of these third world countries and now watching some of these European countries. But the church can be that voice of reason, not vilifying anybody, but saying, look, if we're going to be the church, then we believe that all work has dignity and value and worth. All work should be fairly compensated. And that compensation from the private sector should be based on how much money is that private concern generating. And then how much that money is made available for the people upon which the company is built. And that are inextricably woven to the success of it. This is the type of conversation that needs to be had in this country if we're going to really move forward. We can march together saying we shall overcome. But at the end of the day, when I go to Kroger, they want to know how much money you have in your checking account. And can your debit card take care of the purchase? We're at a very strategic point in the history of this country. Very strategic. And if I'm wrong, you come back and tell me. I think you're going to see it during this upcoming election? How many of you have been following the Black Lives Matters movement? You need to follow it. You need to pay attention to it. You might not agree with it, but their voice is going to be heard. Their voice is going to be heard. They're forcing their voice to be heard by all of the presidential candidates. And you can't control things like that. So you can't control demonstrations becoming violent. Just like out in Ferguson, where they started out with a protest that's going to be nonviolent. And you know, with shots fired. Because once you go down the protest route in the 21st century, you can't keep the violent element from being a part of it. Are y'all following me? That's why the church has to be a voice of reason, to try to bring people to the tables. Let's have a conversation. Otherwise, we're going to see more direct confrontation, more demonstration, and possibly violence that nobody wants to see. I'm out of my time. I thank you for yours.